moved into the house in late October of 2022, just a few days before Halloween. It wasn't some old Victorian or anything like that. Actually, that's part of why I felt comfortable choosing it. It was a normal, single-story house in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Columbus, Ohio. The kind of place where nothing really happens. The previous owner had moved out pretty quickly, which my realtor explained was because of a sudden job relocation. At the time, that didn't raise any red flags for me. The price was slightly below market, which felt like a win, especially since I was buying my first place alone. The first week living there was completely normal. Unpacking, setting up furniture, figuring out where everything should go. It felt quiet in a good way, peaceful, the kind of quiet you look forward to after dealing with apartment neighbors for years. But the first thing that felt off happened on the fifth night. I woke up around 2:30 in the morning to what sounded like a soft thud somewhere in the house. Not loud enough to be something falling over, but just enough to pull me out of sleep. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling. It was getting colder outside, and I knew temperature changes could cause wood to expand or contract. Still, I got up and checked anyway. I walked through the hallway, turned on the kitchen light, checked the living room. Everything looked exactly the way I left it. No windows open, no signs of anything out of place. So I went back to bed and didn't think much of it. Over the next few nights, small things kept happening. Nothing major, just subtle. I'd find cabinet doors slightly open in the kitchen when I was sure I had closed them. One morning, I noticed the back door was unlocked, even though locking it had already become a habit for me. Again, I kept brushing it off. I told myself I was just adjusting to a new environment. It wasn't until about 2 weeks in that something happened that I couldn't really explain away. I had stayed up late that night watching videos in the living room. Around 1 a.m., I turned everything off and headed to my bedroom. As I was walking down the hallway, I clearly heard what sounded like a slow, dragging noise coming from the other end of the house. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like something being pulled across the floor. I froze for a second, just listening. The sound stopped almost immediately after I noticed it. I remember standing there for a good 10 seconds, trying to decide if I was overreacting. Eventually, I walked toward the sound, turning on lights as I went. I checked the guest room, the bathroom, even the small laundry room near the back. Nothing. No explanation for what I heard. That night, I locked my bedroom door before going to sleep. After that, things started getting worse. Not in an obvious way, but in a way that slowly builds up in your head. I'd hear footsteps occasionally, always at night, always faint, like someone trying not to be heard. I started keeping the TV on when I slept, just for the noise. One of the most unsettling moments happened about a week later. I came home from work around 6 p.m. It was already getting dark outside. As I walked up to the front door, I had this weird feeling that I wasn't alone inside the house. I can't really explain why. There was nothing visibly wrong. No broken windows, no open doors, just a feeling. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, calling out, "Hello?" almost as a joke, like I expected someone to answer. Of course no one did. I checked every room again. Same result. But when I got to the kitchen, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the chairs at the dining table was pulled out slightly. I hadn't used that table in days. I always ate in the living room. I stood there staring at it for a while, trying to remember if I could have left it like that. But deep down, I knew I didn't. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing small noises like light taps or something shifting in another room. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, that dragging sound. This time, it lasted longer, and it sounded closer. I grabbed my phone and just sat there in bed, staring at the door. After a few seconds, it stopped. But right after it stopped, I heard something else. A soft, almost inaudible exhale, like someone breathing. From the other side of the door, I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there, completely still, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I decided to check something I hadn't thought about before. The attic. There was a small access panel in the hallway ceiling. I grabbed a chair and pushed it underneath, climbed up, and slid the panel open. As soon as I lifted it, I noticed something strange. The insulation looked disturbed, like it had been moved around recently. I used my phone flashlight and looked further in. That's when I saw it. A small, makeshift space, flattened insulation, a couple of empty water bottles, and what looked like a blanket. My heart started racing immediately. I climbed down, shut the panel, and just stood there in silence, trying to process what I had just seen. I didn't call the police right away. I don't even know why. Maybe I was still trying to rationalize it, but later that day, I installed a small camera in the hallway facing the attic access. That night, I stayed at a friend's place. The next morning, I checked the footage. For the first few hours, nothing happened, just an empty hallway. But around 2:17 a.m., something changed. The attic panel slowly shifted open. Not all the way, just enough for a hand to reach down and push it further. Then I saw him. A man, slowly lowering himself from the attic into my hallway. He was thin, wearing dark clothes, moving carefully like he knew exactly how to stay quiet. He stood there for a moment, just looking around. Then he walked down the hallway toward my bedroom. My empty bedroom. I remember feeling this cold wave wash over me as I watched it, knowing that if I had been there, I don't know what would have happened. The footage showed him going into different rooms, opening cabinets, even sitting on the couch for a while, like he was comfortable there, like it was his place too. Eventually, around 4 a.m., he went back to the hallway, climbed up into the attic, and pulled the panel shut behind him. I called the police immediately after watching that. They came, searched the attic, but he was gone. They said he must have found another way out, possibly through a vent or an opening leading to the garage area. I moved out that same week. I didn't take much with me, just essentials. I didn't care about the rest. What still bothers me isn't just that someone was living in my attic. It's the fact that for weeks I was sleeping just a few feet away from him. And the part I can't stop thinking about is that night I heard breathing outside my door, because now I know. I wasn't imagining it. I closed on the house in early March of 2023, right before the weather started warming up. It sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in a suburb outside of Denver. Nothing about it stood out in a bad way. It was a standard two-story place with a finished basement, recently renovated kitchen, and one of those big backyard decks that realtors love to highlight. The previous owners had already moved out by the time I saw it, so every walkthrough felt a little empty, but not unsettling, just quiet. The kind of quiet you expect from an unoccupied house. The first few days after moving in were normal. Unpacking boxes, figuring out where everything should go, adjusting to the new layout. I live alone, so I was used to silence. In fact, that was one of the reasons I wanted a house instead of an apartment. No upstairs neighbors, no random noise through the walls. Just peace. The first thing that felt off didn't even register as anything serious at the time. It was my second night there. I woke up sometime after 3 a.m. because I thought I heard my phone vibrate on the nightstand. I reached over, checked it, but there were no notifications. I figured I must have dreamed it. As I was about to go back to sleep, I heard it again. Not from my phone this time, but somewhere else in the room. A faint buzzing sound. It stopped as soon as I focused on it. I remember sitting up in bed for a minute, listening, but it didn't happen again, so I brushed it off. Over the next week, I started noticing small inconsistencies. Things I couldn't quite explain, but also couldn't prove, were wrong. One morning, I found the sliding door to the backyard slightly open. Not enough to notice at a glance, but enough that the cold air had crept into the kitchen overnight. I was almost certain I had locked it before going to bed. Another time, I found one of the basement lights turned on, even though I hadn't gone down there since the day I moved in. Again, I told myself it was just me, forgetting. Moving is stressful. It messes with your routine. About 10 days in, something happened that made me start paying closer attention. I got home from work around 5:30 in the evening. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the garage door was slightly open, just a few inches. I always closed it fully. I even double-checked it most days before leaving. I sat in my car for a moment, just staring at it, trying to decide if I was overthinking it. Eventually, I got out, walked up, and lifted the garage door the rest of the way. Everything inside looked normal. My car's spot was empty. Storage boxes were still stacked along the wall. Nothing appeared to be missing. But there was this smell. It was faint, but noticeable. Not something rotten or strong, just unfamiliar, like someone else's laundry detergent or something. I didn't call anyone. I didn't check with neighbors. I just went inside and tried to ignore it. That night, I made sure every door and window was locked. I even checked the basement windows, which I hadn't really thought about before. Everything seemed secure. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again. This time, it wasn't a noise that woke me. It was that same smell, stronger now, like it had somehow made its way upstairs. I sat up in bed, immediately alert. The house was completely dark, completely silent. Then I heard it. A soft creak. Not from the floor under me, but from the hallway just outside my bedroom. It sounded like someone shifting their weight on the wooden floorboards. I froze. I didn't move, didn't speak. I just listened. Another creak, slightly closer this time. Then silence. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it toward the closed bedroom door. I waited, expecting the handle to move, or something to happen, but nothing did. After a few minutes, I got up and opened the door quickly, shining the light into the hallway. Empty. I checked every room upstairs, then the main floor. Nothing. When I got to the basement door, I hesitated. It was closed, just like I left it. I stood there for a second, listening. That's when I heard a faint thump from the other side. Not loud, but unmistakable, like something had bumped into a wall or fallen over. I stepped back immediately. I didn't open it. Instead, I went back upstairs, locked my bedroom door, and stayed awake until morning. The next day, I called a friend to come over. I didn't want to check the basement alone. When we finally opened the door and went down together, everything looked normal at first. Boxes where I left them, nothing obviously out of place. But as we moved further in, my friend pointed something out. A small section of drywall near the back corner looked different, slightly discolored, like it had been patched at some point. I hadn't noticed it before. We walked over and looked closer. There was a faint outline of a square cut into the wall, about the size of a small door. My friend knocked on it lightly. It sounded hollow. That was enough to make my stomach drop. I grabbed a screwdriver and started prying at the edge. It didn't take much effort before the panel came loose. Behind it was a narrow crawl space, just big enough for someone to move through. It extended further back into darkness. And that smell? It was much stronger coming from inside there. We didn't go in. We just stood there, staring. That's when we heard it. Movement. From deeper inside the crawl space. Not loud, but clear. Something shifting. My friend immediately backed up, telling me to call the police. I didn't hesitate this time. When they arrived, they went into the crawl space with flashlights. It took a few minutes, but eventually one of them called out to the others. They found someone. A man, hiding further back in the crawl space, surrounded by food wrappers, bottles, and what looked like some of my missing items. He had apparently been living there, coming out at night when he thought I was asleep or gone. The officer later told me that the layout of the crawl space connected to the garage through a small access point, which explained how he was getting in and out without being noticed. I moved out within a week. I didn't stay another night there after that. What sticks with me isn't just that someone was living inside the walls of my house. It's how close he got without me realizing it. The creaks in the hallway, the smell, that noise behind the basement door, and the part I still think about sometimes is how long he had been there before I ever moved in. I moved into the house in the middle of July, right in the peak of a heat wave. It was in a quiet neighborhood outside of Nashville, the kind of place where every house looks almost identical and people keep to themselves. The house itself wasn't old, maybe built in the early 2000s, and it had just been renovated before being put on the market. New floors, fresh paint, updated kitchen. Nothing about it felt creepy or unusual when I first saw it. If anything, it felt too clean, like no one had really lived there in a while. I signed the papers, got the keys, and moved in that same week. The first couple of nights were completely normal. I was exhausted from moving, so I'd fall asleep pretty quickly. The only thing I noticed was how quiet the house was. Not peaceful quiet, but almost empty. like sound didn't travel the way it should. I remember thinking it was probably just because there was no furniture yet. The first strange thing happened on the fourth night. I woke up around 1:40 in the morning feeling too warm, which didn't make sense because I had the AC running. I checked my phone, then got up to adjust the thermostat. When I walked into the hallway, I immediately felt the difference. It was noticeably colder outside my bedroom than inside. Not slightly colder, a lot colder. Enough that it made me stop for a second. I walked over to the thermostat and saw it was set to 68, exactly where I left it. The AC was running normally. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it, and that's when I heard a faint clicking sound coming from downstairs. It was slow and consistent, like someone tapping a fingernail against wood. I stayed still, listening. The clicking went on for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I didn't go downstairs that night. I went back to my room, locked the door, and tried to sleep. The next morning, everything looked normal. I even checked around the living room where I thought the sound had come from. Nothing out of place. Over the next few days, the temperature issue kept happening. My bedroom would feel warmer than the rest of the house at night, even though the AC was running constantly. I started keeping my door open to balance it out, but that just made it worse in a different way. I began hearing things more clearly, small sounds mostly, light footsteps, usually from downstairs. Once, I heard what sounded like a cabinet door closing. Another time, it was that same clicking noise again, but louder this time. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the house was settling. Maybe the new wood was expanding with the heat. Maybe it was the air ducts. But none of those explanations really fit the pattern. About a week in, I started noticing something else. The basement door. It was located just off the kitchen. A simple wooden door that led down to an unfinished basement. I rarely went down there. There wasn't much to see. Just concrete floors, exposed pipes, and a few leftover items from the previous owner. But I started noticing that the door would sometimes be slightly open, even though I was sure I had closed it. Not wide open, just enough to create a thin gap of darkness. The first time I closed it and didn't think much of it. The second time, I felt a little uneasy. By the third time, I started checking it every night before going to bed. One night, I decided to do something different. I placed a small piece of tape across the door in the frame, so I'd know if it had been opened while I was asleep. It was a simple trick, but it made me feel a little more in control. That night, I went to bed around midnight. I remember feeling on edge for no clear reason. I left my bedroom door slightly open, something I hadn't been doing before. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first, but then I heard it. That clicking sound again, louder than before, and closer. It wasn't coming from downstairs this time. It was coming from the hallway, right outside my room. I held my breath and listened. Click, click, click. It was slow, deliberate, not random. After a few seconds, it stopped. Then I heard something else. The faint sound of the basement door creaking open. I got out of bed slowly, trying not to make any noise, and stepped into the hallway. It was dark, but I could see the outline of the kitchen at the end, and the basement door. It was open, wider than I had ever seen it before. The piece of tape was gone. I stood there, frozen, trying to decide what to do. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The darkness beyond the basement door wasn't completely dark. There was a shape there, low to the ground, almost like someone crouching just at the bottom of the stairs. I couldn't see details, just a silhouette. And then it moved. Not quickly, slowly, like it was adjusting its position. That was enough for me. I stepped back into my room, locked the door, and called the police. I stayed on the phone with the dispatcher until they arrived. I didn't look out into the hallway again. I didn't want to see if it was still there. When the officers got there, they cleared the house first, then went down into the basement. A few minutes later, one of them called for backup. They had found something. There was a section of the basement wall that had been modified, a hidden opening leading into a narrow space between the walls. And inside that space, they found a man. He had been living there. They later told me he had likely been there even before I moved in, using the basement as a way to move in and out of the walls without being noticed. The clicking sound? One of the officers said it was probably him tapping on the wood, either out of habit or to check if anyone was nearby. I didn't stay in that house after that night. I didn't even go back inside alone. What still bothers me isn't just that someone was living in the walls, it's that moment in the hallway when I saw that shape at the bottom of the basement stairs. Because if I had taken a few more steps forward, I would have been standing right in front of him.